you want this chair? Okay.
Oh, yeah, good, yeah. Oh, a little busy.
Well, it's wonderful to see so many people. So officially, good evening, and thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Catherine Barnett, and I'm the editor of both the Press Democrat and the newly relaunched Sonoma magazine. So on behalf of my colleagues here tonight, I'd like to welcome you to the first of what we hope will be an occasional series of conversations about issues that matter to our community. We're calling this effort Shine a Light. You may have seen the posters because, well, that's what we're hoping to do. A newspaper plays many roles in our community, but one of the most important is to bring light to the inequities and lapses that perhaps keep us from being all we should be. It's a charge we've always taken seriously, but since our return to local ownership a year ago, we have looked for ways to make this commitment a part of the larger community. That's what tonight's about. Most of you are familiar with our ongoing coverage of homelessness, either through the stories of individual struggle or of public attempts to grapple with the issue. But it was one particular story that moved readers in a way that prompted tonight's discussion. Reporter Jeremy Hay, sitting right there, and writing in Sonoma magazine, told the story of the young people he found living among us, and that's what I think shocked a lot of people, without a home during that one cold, wet week in December. Jeremy is a careful reporter and a gifted writer. He told the stories of several young people living on the streets of Santa Rosa in a way that really touched a nerve. And working with Jeremy on that story, I know I'll always remember the morning he came in after a very long night and recounted for me the story of a young man camping in the rain at Howard Park, where most of us take our kids, to ride the merry-go-round or ponies or whatever. And this young man studied surrounded by books in his tent and then turned up at the JC for a class. And his fellow students had absolutely no idea how or where he lived. The detail of his piece touched many of you who came tonight, including one woman in the audience who emailed to tell me she and her friends were coming to this discussion because Jeremy's story, and I'm quoting her, slapped us all in the face. In part, Jeremy's story touched readers because it dealt with homeless people who were young, and because of that, seemed especially to deserve a better shot. So, by the numbers, in January 2013, there were 4,280 homeless people counted in Sonoma County in the census. And that suggests that throughout the year, there were many more people who suffer homelessness. Then of those counted, the fastest growing segment of the county's homeless are the 1,128 young people under the age of 24. Many are very young. There were 277 children younger than 18 who are homeless and without parents. And that number is growing as well. It's tripled in 4 years. There were 92 homeless youth aged 12 to 17 that were counted in 2009. But by 2013, it had grown to 277. Even a story as powerful as Jeremy's goes only so far. And there comes a point when we need to move beyond being troubled to making things better. And that's why we brought together a group of panelists tonight who have the position and the commitment to help us better understand what progress might look like. Joining me to help guide the conversation will be our editorial director, Paul Gullixson. Many of you know Paul. He oversees our editorial pages and helps formulate our institutional opinion. So Paul, hey Paul. He said she was going to bring his mother, but you don't look like it. So Paul's going to present a brief overview of homelessness and to provide a little bit of context for our conversation. Then Jeremy is going to talk about what he saw when he was reporting his story. And then our panelists are going to describe from various vantage points sort of the reality in the trenches and their reality as decision makers. And finally, we'll open the floor to questions. So please be thinking of what you might like to ask as you listen to our panelists. So to start us off, here's Paul.
Thank you, Kathy. Well, it's my job to just to set the scene a little bit more before we introduce our panelists and get on with the main event. As Kathy mentioned, recent reports show that homelessness in Sonoma County has increased significantly, particularly in the last 5 years. The countywide census of the homeless population showed a 25% jump from 2009 to 2011 alone. A survey taken last year, as Kathy noted, found 4,280 homeless people in the county on a single day. So based on this number and the average length of stay of homelessness, we can conclude that over the course of the year, nearly 10,000 people found themselves homeless at some point during 2013. To put that in perspective, if these people were assembled in one place, they would represent the 6th largest city in Sonoma County. Larger than Cloverdale, larger than Cotati, larger than Sebastopol. Who are these people? Well, contrary to conventional beliefs, many of them, in reality, are not strangers. They are our neighbors. According to the census from last year, more than 70% were residents of this county for 10 years or more prior to becoming homeless. Many are natives of Sonoma County. According to the survey, 1 in 3 are homeless, not because of some of the conventional things we think of, but 1 in 3 are homeless because of a job loss. Nearly 20%, in fact, still have jobs. More than half previously lived in a home that they rented or owned with a partner or by themselves. About half of these homeless individuals, roughly 5,000 people, were experiencing homelessness for the very first time in their lives. But here's one of the most troubling changes. According to this recent count, teenagers and young adults are disproportionately represented in those numbers. As Kathy noted, in 2009, a survey found 277 young adults and children, 24 years and younger, among Sonoma County's unsheltered. By 2013, that number of unaccompanied children and young adults had grown to 1,128. To put that number in perspective, that is about equal in size to the entire student population of Pioneer High School. 20% of these youths say they had been part of the foster care system in the past. 50% of them say that the primary cause of their homelessness was an argument with a family member or a friend. 61% of these young people were experiencing homelessness for the very first time. And there are many other challenges weighing on these individuals. As we all know, in terms of unemployment and difficulty in finding housing, no other age demographic has been harder hit by the recent economic downturn than those between the ages of 18 and 29. What we hope to understand better today is why more are ending up on the streets, our streets. Why far fewer are finding emergency shelter than those in the general homeless population. And what are some of the solutions for dealing with these problems? Now, as we know, this is not an issue of numbers. These are the stats. But this is really an issue about people. And to look at the human side of the story, we will begin with Jeremy Hay, the man who slapped us in the face with his story, and chronicling the lives of some of Sonoma County's homeless through his story, Lost in Paradise. So Jamie, I'm going to have you get us started. Why don't you, if you wouldn't mind, tell us, what did you see when you went out and spent time with individuals who you discussed in your story, and why do you believe these numbers are increasing? And first, check to make sure, is your mic on?
Well, first, we'll ask for help turning on.
It's probably on.
Is it on?
It's on. Hold it close to your mouth.
Well, thank you, Paul and Kathy. It's great to be here. First of all, I think the real slap in the face was to all of us, and to me included. I was just the first person in line to be slapped in the face and by the experience and the realities of these young people whom I spent roughly a week with off and on. And as to what I learned, you know, it's funny. My first newspaper about 20 odd years ago was the Tenderloin Times in San Francisco, and it was started by 2 homeless people. So I've been reporting off and on in and around homelessness and with people who are homeless for a good number of years. But there's always something to be learned, and one thing that I learned that you'd think I would have learned long ago was how very literal the meaning is of having nowhere to go. I spent hours and hours sort of walking around with Charlotte and Jesse and Jerry and Jeremy on the other end there. Aside from a few places like Say's Coffee House or Voices, the facility set up and run by people who have come out of the foster system for foster youth. There's very few places to go. You go to the mall, but there's no, before I came here, I went home and kind of relaxed and got some notes together and that kind of thing. There's nowhere to go. And you wander from place to place, or I did with the young people I was writing about, wandered from place to place, from the park, with Charlotte and Jesse, from the park where they woke up to Railroad Square, to the Gospel Mission for something to eat, back to the railroad tracks. This goes on for hours, and it's a very, I think, debilitating type of experience to go through for hours on end, and you wait, too, for the time that dinner is served, or lunch is served, or the warming station is open, or at the Catholic Charities, on the Services Center. So that was something that I found that really, and that leads to all sorts of other problems, but which I guess we can get into. But that
So it's just sort of the general monotony of homelessness.
yeah, and you asked me, I think, why I thought it was growing.
Yeah, what you saw, so what you came away with.
Well, I guess the joy of spending some time with a few people is that you really get to know them in a way that's greater than you would normally reporting about a large sector of society. And you get to know the details of people's lives a little bit more. So I know more about why Charlotte, Jesse, and Jeremy and Jerry are homeless than about why they became homeless than larger numbers that there are. But you touched on and the survey touched on the reasons. People leave broken families. Sometimes they leave to help the family, especially if our economic circumstances are really a strain. But people, leave broken families. Families break under stress. The economy has been very stressful. So from my reporting and from what I've been told by people in the field, that has had a significant impact in the last 5 or 6 years or so.
Sometimes we take for granted our safety nets that we all have and fall through.
Yeah.
One question I had, you chronicled one of the 4 people you chronicled. You talked to Jerry, who started off your story, the description of him in his tent, in his textbook from the JC that was getting damp because there's a leak in his tent. It was a very compelling image. But he noted that it was so much better that the concrete sucked the life out of you when he'd been sleeping out in front of Chops. My question is, one of the numbers that we come across is that for the overall homeless population, about 23% are actually living in some sort of emergency shelter. But for those who are 24 years and younger, about 95% are in shelter. Only 5% are finding a place within our system to live. Why is that? This is kind of the question we're going to ask. Some of you can help answer too.
Well, I know that Jerry, for example, just didn't like shelters. He didn't like the rules of shelters. He also was less comfortable with, like Charlotte and Jesse, with, they're young, and the shelters are predominantly occupied by people who are older. And an 18-year-old, a 22-year-old in a room full of 40 to 60-year-olds here, mingling and socializing may not be comfortable, let alone in a large facility where you don't know anybody. You're there for no other reason except the fact that you have no other place to go. You have on the streets a learned fear of or caution about being molested, being approached, being hassled or harassed. You bring that into a confined area, that's another obstacle, I think, to why younger people don't go to shelters.
Listen, thank you, Jeremy, and I hope we're eager to hear your contributions. I know the rest of you probably want to answer that question, but we need to introduce you first. And so we're now going to go to Kathy, and she's going to have the honor of introducing Kathy.
Okay, if the bold print in front isn't enough, if you could just raise your hands when I introduce you, because I think I'm out of the wrong order. I'm going to start with Mike Johnson, the new CEO of the Committee on the Shelterless in Petaluma. And at one time, he found himself homeless in Petaluma. That was in 1991. And in his words, I wound up on the streets with a sleeping bag and a small suitcase and no money in my pocket, no nothing. That's how we became associated with COTS and the kitchen in Petaluma. So we're eager to hear what you have to tell us. Jenny Lynn Holmes is the Director of Shelter and Housing for Catholic Charities. She oversees the delivery of homeless services in Sonoma and Humboldt and Napa counties, and each year provides services to more than 5,000 homeless individuals. She operates the largest shelter for families between Oregon and the Golden Gate. So you too will have a lot to tell us from the streets, as it were. Hank Schroeder is the police chief of Santa Rosa and an active member of the broader community. Hank, I meant to ask you how long you've worked for SRPD.
22 years.
All right, so he's out there a lot, and he's here to give his perspective on the intersection of law enforcement and homelessness. Shirley Zane, who we might say needs no introduction, is the Sonoma County Supervisor who represents the 3rd District, which is Central Santa Rosa and most of Barnett Park, including Sonoma State University. Before she entered politics, Shirley advocated for the elderly, and in her public role, she's long pushed for a social services agenda in the public arena. She's here to talk about county efforts for the homeless. Matt Martin is the Executive Director of Social Advocates for Youth, or SAY, and he's here to describe the transitional housing facility proposed by his organization for the old Warwick Hospital in Bennett Valley. It would eventually offer long-term housing for, and our clips had 2 numbers here, so correct me if I'm wrong, for 63 youth escaping life on the street or exiting, as Paul described, foster care. Charles Jensen is the founder of Transitional Housing Complex for Veterans. He's now a Bennett Valley resident, and he'll talk about the reasons he and his neighbors oppose the Dream Center. And finally, we have Chuck Cornell. He's the Executive Director of Burbank Housing, the nonprofit that manages and builds affordable housing. And he's here to talk a little bit about the effects the housing supply have on homelessness. So we're eager to hear what you have to say, and Paul's going to get us started.
First, can we have a round of applause for our panelists here? Getting 7 people lined up on a government holiday is not an easy thing to do, and they were all very willing to be here, and we really much appreciate it. And those of you who have not had a chance to read Jeremy's story, I really encourage you to do that. It's really a beautiful piece of literary journalism, really. And I teach a course at Sonoma State, and it was the main focus of my discussion with the students yesterday as a fine news feature. I'm getting them fired up about it. So, yeah, we have copies. So don't leave until you've had a chance to read the story. Anyway, we'd like to start with kind of more of an idea, a description, report from the front lines of this. And we'd like to start with Jenny Lynn of Catholic Charities and Mike Johnson of COTS to give us a sense of what they're seeing. So, if you don't mind, let's start with Jenny Lynn. What are you seeing in the front lines, and why do you see these numbers increasing from your perspective? I know you have some of your own numbers you want to share too.
I think that there's a lot of reasons that lead to homeless situations, and I think I heard recently somebody say, homelessness doesn't discriminate, and it really doesn't. It's people that are our neighbors, it's families, it's children, it's the elderly, it's people who are experiencing crisis, and they fall through every safety net, and we're kind of the last line of defense for them. And it's really important that we're there and we're able to understand the different complexities to the issues that we see. There's kind of three trends, at least, that I'm seeing in the service we're providing. The first is what Jeremy very eloquently talked about in his story, and that's about youth. There's a high percentage of youth that has increased over the years. And just to kind of paint a picture of what we're seeing at Catholic Charities is in just a 6-month period, we saw 692 youth under the age of 24 enter our services, which equated to about 23% of the people we were serving in that 6-month period. And that's a big population, and this is a specific population that needs specific attention and specific interventions. And the average age of the person who lives at our family shelter is only 12 years old. So we have people in our shelter right now as we speak that are newborns, entering middle school, entering high school, trying to get into college. We've got a whole range of people that we're trying to serve. And I think that a lot of times people don't realize that it's kids. We just had, at our family shelter this week, we had somebody give birth. And this baby's first months of life is going to be in a shelter. And so it touches everybody in the community. The second trend we're seeing is the rise of first-time homeless, as well as a growing population of chronically homeless. So again, there was a variety of different people that we're serving, but they're getting farther apart in terms of people just falling out of homelessness, as well as people who have been homeless for a long period of time. We haven't been able to find the right intervention for them at this point. In our Sam Jones shelter last year, there were 191 people that were homeless for the first time ever. They had never experienced homelessness before. They'd never entered any service system before. And I think the last and probably the most difficult trend I'm seeing is there's an extreme bottleneck in the shelter systems. And I see several shelter service providers here, and they're all nodding their heads that there is an extreme bottleneck. And the bottleneck is coming because we can't get people out into housing quickly enough. The average length of stay went from 44 days in our shelter to 76 days in a year. So people are staying longer, which means that people can't get into shelter. So there are waiting lists right now as we speak. Our family shelter has 40 families living outside waiting to get into shelter. Our single adult shelter has a massive waiting list as well. So people are trying to get into shelter, but we can't get other people out quickly enough in order to get the other people in. Right now, 53% of the families in our family shelter could move out. They have the money to do so if there was enough affordable housing. So there's 53% of the families we're serving that do not need to be a shelter right now. And so affordable housing is really going to be the key to how we can help move this forward. We need to write our system in a way in that we create more housing opportunities for people so people's experiencing homelessness are there for shorter lengths of time. And we also need to look at this as a community. How can we as a community think innovatively, think outside of the box, and try to work together to solve this issue? And I think that there's a really good story. I met a family at our safe parking program, which some of you may have heard of this week. And it was a family. It was a mother, a father, and a 14-year-old daughter. They'd only been homeless for a week and a half. And the father had lost his job just a few months ago, and they've been struggling every month to maintain their housing. And then finally, they just couldn't maintain it any longer. And so they packed up everything they had into their last possession, which was their truck. And they pulled into our safe parking site on Monday night, and I was there, and I went to greet them. And the mother, the first thing she did was run up to me and say, I need to use the restroom. She ran to I showed her where the restroom was, she went to the restroom. She came back to me and said, that's the first time I've been able to use the restroom all day. We can do better than that. We can give people shelter, we can give people restrooms, we can give them the dignity of a shower. That 14-year-old girl, that 14-year-old girl was getting ready every morning in their truck. She couldn't shower, they couldn't use the restroom, but she was still making it to school every single day. The testament to these people's perseverance and bravery in these situations is just, it's humbling to me. Every single day I get to meet these people. And so now they have a safe place to be, sleep, shower, and get the services that they need. So.
Thank you, Jane. One of the, as the overseer of a lot of letters to the editor that come through the newspaper, one of the perceptions out there is that somehow homeless people prefer it that way. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the assumptions that I see being challenged in the numbers. I mean, I think the figure we in the most recent survey showed that something like 80% really would like to be off the street if they had the resources, the opportunity to do that. Mm-hmm. And there are certainly the chronic, the homeless who consider themselves urban campers, but that's not really the majority of it.
No. Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to Mike. Is this what you're seeing too, Mike, at COTS and Petaluma?
Oh, absolutely. We've got the same bottleneck situation at COTS. We run emergency shelter for single adults. We have transitional housing for families and single adults. And we have a number of permanent housing and permanent supportive housing for families, single adults, and veterans. And the bottleneck is both at the front end and at the back end. So imagine if you are a homeless single adult, you're living by the creek or the river or out in the bushes, it's the middle of winter, and you finally made a decision in your life that you want to change things. Now's the time. I'm too uncomfortable, I'm freezing, I'm 45 years old, I need to make a change. So you go to your local shelter, which in our case would be the Mary Isaac Center, and you say, I'm ready. And what do we say? Stand in line for 2 months. Sorry, we can't help you today. I think I want to make another really important point because we're going to talk a lot about the economic factors, the bottlenecks, the lack of supportive housing, lack of affordable housing, jobs, and so forth and so on. But what it really comes down to is that we live in a society that has not yet decided that it's unacceptable for children to sleep on the street. Another point would be every chronically homeless adult that you see out pushing a shopping cart or picking through a garbage can out in front of Starbucks was once a beautiful child, just like many of your own. And then something happened to them. Maybe it was abuse, neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, loss of a parent, incarceration, what have you. And that sent that child on a downward spiral that included coping strategies like drug use, alcohol use, so forth and so on. We call these things adverse childhood experiences. And the research shows that folks that are homeless have about 400% more ACEs than people who don't experience homelessness. So there's a direct connection between the things that happen to children when they are young and their homelessness later on in life. So efforts like Matt's to take folks who are young and give them the support that they need to build their resiliency, to keep them away from the coping strategies that are destructive in their lives, are a huge part of what this county and this country have to do to solve the problem. It's not just about jobs and housing. It's about building resiliency for kids. It's about protecting them from the kinds of experiences that happen to them that lead to homelessness later on in life. So these are all things that we've got to address if we really want to solve the problem. We could build 10,000 units of affordable housing in this county today, and kids would still be winding up on the street tomorrow. And they would stay on the street because they don't have the supports that they need to get through the system. They don't have a way to build resiliency, and maybe they don't have any family to support them. So it's a much bigger issue maybe than we're even considering today, and I'd just like to put that out there.
Mike, thank you. You know, as Jeremy's story pointed out, there are, I think the number was 584 emergency shelter beds in Sonoma County, but only 6 are set aside for teens between the ages of 12 and 17, and only 7 are set aside for youths aging out of foster care. So my question is, why is that? Actually, it's a two-part question. Why is that? Do we need to provide more housing for a younger age group? And are these younger individuals going to find their way into these? Are they going to take advantage? You want to answer that, or do you want to?
No, I think Matt would probably love to answer that question.
Sure, thank you, Paul. And before I go any further, you know, I want to applaud you for being here. You really are the difference, truly. In this equation that we're talking about, this conversation we're having in the community, it's you. The 7 of us, 8 of us up here can only do so much. It's you committing to action, valuing the people who've been largely unvalued, that's going to make the difference in the end. And so to talk about this conversation here today and to talk about why, what our youth are experiencing on the streets, each and every one of you and each and every one of us, we've all hit rock bottoms in our lives. We all have. I guarantee it. The question is what happened when we hit rock bottom? Who was there for us? Who was the voice? Who was the hand? Who was that guiding presence in our lives? Now subtract that person from your life's equation when you hit rock bottom, and then try to consider where you'd be right now. Raise your hand if your dream when you were a child were to be homeless. Please. If each and every one of us asked every kindergartner tomorrow morning in school what they wanted to be when they grew up, not a single one would say homeless. Not a single one would say they want to be a runaway teenager. Not a single one would say they'd want to exit foster care system without the support that they need. Not a single one. So what happens? What happens between then and now? It's those adverse childhood experiences that begin charting a course in these young people's lives. This trauma, whether it's coming through abuse, neglect, violence, abandonment, creates cycles of detachment, cycles of broken trust that these young people have a difficult time reestablishing. That's why I applaud each and every one of you in this room here this afternoon. Because you just being here is an important part of the conversation and helping us figure out how we can, as a community, begin reestablishing those connections. And so for the population that we're talking about, these young people are not victimizers. They're victims. When we look at the homeless youth count that was done most recently, 70% of those young people said they were experiencing physical abuse where they were coming from. 1 in 3 said they were experiencing it always to often. 1 in 3 said they were experiencing sexual abuse. 1 in 8 said they were experiencing it always to often. 90% of our teens on the street, our children on the streets of Sonoma County, 90% are contacted by a sexual predator within 24 hours of being on the street. This is not okay. We can do better as a community, and this is our chance. This is our chance to begin shifting this dialogue here today and ever forward, because these young people, as they're working to turn their lives around, they're reaching out. Remember that rock bottom experience? When you reached out, they are doing the same. And we have to ask ourselves, whose hand is going to be there when they reach out? It could be ours as a community, and it should be ours because it's our kids. And so when we look at this situation, we have 6 beds for teenagers in this county. We have 7 emergency shelter beds for young people coming out of foster care right now. We need more. And we have to get creative. We have to get innovative. It cannot be the same formula that we've been using all these years. We have to seize the opportunity and seize this momentum to make everlasting change for this generation who's reaching out, who's set to be the next lost generation in our community.
Thank you, Matt. One question I wanted to ask Mike before we move on from you. I wondered